Thank you so much, Camila, for joining us. I've been following your work for several years now, and you're my favorite Twitter account. But can you just start by introducing yourself and where you're calling from?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm flattered that you enjoy my social media. Yeah, I'm in the Tropico of Cochabamba, which is where Evo Morales first kind of became a popular union leader, and that's where he kind of launched the movement towards socialism, and it's a really important base for the movement party. And of course, my colleague Oli Vargas, who's here with me now, not next to me, but he lives in a neighboring town. We're in Villa Tunari, which is kind of a town that has some tourism, some like a couple of amenities, and it was just kind of a nice place for me to take a break because I've been following things in the city, in La Paz and El Alto. I was also on the campaign trail in Oruro and the city of Cochabamba with the president-elect at the time, presidential candidate Luis Arce, for some period of the campaign. And yeah, so I'm of course a producer, presenter with Telesur English and also with Saskatchewan News. And I'm here serving as a correspondent for Telesur English on a temporary basis.
Cool. Yeah, I think Ollie is our most frequent returning guest on the podcast. We've
I thought he was. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, he's been on like 3 times, and it's been a while. We've been wanting to have you on for quite some time as well. So we're happy that you joined us. I have some just like personal questions for you, if that's okay. Like, if you can tell us like how you got into journalism and how did you grow up in Latin America or in the global North, and how did you land a job at Telesur?
Yeah, I grew up in the global North in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh my God.
My parents are from El Salvador, both of them. They're both, involved in the struggle there. And so I have that connection to El Salvador. I've been there, off and on, but I've never lived there. And how I got into journalism, I mean, I guess I was just already kind of doing it with some sort of the movements and organizing that I was doing wherever I was. Nothing serious, but it's just something that, exactly what I do now, I was doing in some capacity before. And our former director of Telesur English, Pablo Vivanco, just kind of saw me on Facebook and told me to apply. I mean, I was just doing the same kind of internet rants as maybe I would now, just kind of a post like saying, white people are racist or, whatever the hell, like pupusas are good or like I love tacos. Like, I don't know what I could have been saying, but it was, along the same sort of things I do now. And he just thought it would be a good fit. And so I just applied, and literally like a week later I was in Ecuador. I was trying to find a home in Latin America. I had been in Brazil with the MST. I had, with the landless workers movement, I had taken a course there, but then after that I had stayed to kind of be in the city of Sao Paulo and Rio and just like hang out with friends or whatever. And then I had to leave and I went to Toronto where my parents were, and I just had to get back. And so that was my opportunity. So I spent no time at all in Toronto and ended up coming right back to Quito, where I lived for about 4 years. So I no longer live there now, but I'm letting Telesur move me around now.
Wow, Phoenix is a hellhole. I've only been there like once, or I've been there several times, but it's kind of like the bastion of the right-wing project in the United States. I think a lot of people think it originated in the South, et cetera, but neoliberalism, the development project and the aspect of it actually developed out of Phoenix, and like with the Barry Goldwater Institute, and the really exploitative, extractive programs like for water. They siphoned it off from the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation, like 1/3 of the Navajo Nation doesn't have clean drinking water, but the water that should be going to Navajo people is like siphoned off to water, golf courses in Phoenix, Arizona, where there shouldn't be grass anyways, because it's like one of the hottest places in the United States. So that's really fascinating.
It's something that like the Barry Goldwater stuff is something that people there are very proud of. But alongside that, there's a really strong sense now. I mean, I haven't been there now in 4 years. And before that, I wasn't living there anyways. I was just visiting. But more and more I'm seeing that there's this development of a strong sense of pride in Chicano and Native American culture. And that's a really interesting aspect that probably doesn't exist in other parts of the US. I don't feel it was as strong when I was growing up. Of course, like the only sort of like alternative political forces were just like some anarchist kids who would maybe make some like vegan raps for like people at like anti-migrant detention rallies. But it seems like there's more and more there now. But of course, when I left there, it was just so obvious that, I was pretty young, but it was just so obvious that there was nothing for me. And that, the kind of politics and things I had in mind were just much more like worldly. My parents had lived in so many countries, speak different languages. And obviously Arizona is a very limited place, and it is kind of like an extreme situation, even for the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so talk about the role of Telesur in covering, the Latin American left movements. How was it founded, and what role does it continue to play?
Yeah, Telesur was a vision of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro, and they actually founded Telesur 15 years ago. So it's along the same timeline as Radio Kasashwankoka, which just tells you, how many important things were happening around the continent at that time. But it's just been absolutely crucial to so many events that have gone on around the continent. In the case of Bolivia, there's just absolutely no other media outlet in the entire world, especially an international outlet that's been covering these events all along. On our multi-screen TV viewer in our office, we watched Bolivia TV every single day. Bolivia TV is not that interesting. It is like state television. And even here in Bolivia, most people would prefer to watch like a private channel. It's just, a lot more entertaining in a lot of ways. But that's something we always kept track of. And, you see like on Saturday morning, Evo Morales playing soccer. But you also see like a lot of the indigenous traditional cultural festivals and, commemorative dates and things like that. And that was really important to Telesur's coverage in Spanish specifically, all along, because at the time that Telesur was founded was around the time that Evo Morales came to power. So we've always had that strong relationship. Our team here in La Paz, not here where I am, but in the city of La Paz, is they've all been here since the founding of Telesur. And so they've seen everything, and they're just absolutely like working around the clock to cover, everything that happens. And they have a very strong, they're extremely experienced in Bolivian national media, and they just absolutely the most top professionals we could possibly have. And of course, it was our job in English to try to meet that, to try to mirror that in some way in English. And I don't think we were able to, do justice to it until 2019. And that's when I came across my colleague, Ollie. And, I just realized that there was somebody who knew a great deal of history, particularly for his age, about Bolivia. And I could kind of like use him to, I had him on as a guest, but to try to find out like some of the context of what Bolivia was living, specifically with like the attacks on Evo Morales and the kind of things that were going on within these far right sectors and pockets within the country that led to the coup. So I do think that like we saw both in, at Telesur, both in Caracas and Quito, what was going on, and we saw it building. I guess when it came, it ended up coming really fast, but I don't think there was anyone that was as prepared to report on it as we were. And that's why I came here during the coup.
Yeah, and it's been the best coverage, especially Kasachin News. And, they, one thing that, in the North, a lot of journalists talk about is like, the repression of journalists elsewhere in conflict zones. But you don't see that kind of those same gestures extended to Telesur journalists or the journalists who were attacked at the Kasachin Koka radio station as well. And so, like, I think understanding that, like, these journalists were out there, not only like, so I went to Venezuela, I went to Caracas, and I went to one of the headquarters of Telesur, and like people don't understand that the sanctions impact, all kind of sectors of life, including, people who should be getting paid for the work that they're doing for these news stations. And a lot of people are doing it not for free, but they're not, it's not a living, it's not a living wage, right? And so I think there's this kind of acrimony that comes from the North, especially in the United States, towards Latin American journalists who work for these outlets. There's not the same kind of solidarity and attention to the people like such as yourself and Ollie, who are providing some of the most, intimate kind of coverage of the movements in the South. And so I think that needs to be recognized. And there's just this kind of animosity. I would call it an animosity towards Telesur from the North, and I've been a fan of it since it started. That's how I stay in touch with what's going on in the South. And so I just wanted to say that I really appreciate and recognize like the sacrifices that those journalists make to get these stories out there.
Absolutely. I think because of, how shallow the depth of English coverage has been in general, it's like a smaller version of Telesur Spanish. People don't understand how wide of a network we have, because in Spanish, of course, we have correspondent offices in numerous countries, like 40 countries. And those correspondent offices sometimes are like a team of 5 people, who are just working sometimes around the clock when something happens, whether in Guatemala or Honduras or Argentina. And, these people are, in general, of course, these people are leftists. They're in line with the ideals of the Bolivian government, Venezuela, perhaps. But these are like, professional journalists nonetheless. And I don't think people realize the extent to which teams kind of have freedom to report on what's going on without any, sort of editorial control from the center. And that's kind of something that I've dealt with a lot before, is people saying that, calling me a propagandist. Propaganda is what I did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when I wasn't working for Telesur. And the difference now is just that I have the label because I work for a company. But I guess like the type of like work I do hasn't changed. I don't see it as any worse than anyone who labels themselves independent. But I definitely have seen the way in which journalists of the global North like to, position themselves as better for having that label independent.
So let's turn to Bolivia. And you've been following Luis Arce, you've been following the MAS movement and the elections recently. But one thing that we haven't really covered in our conversation with Ollie is kind of the right-wing forces that are clamoring for another coup right now. And what kind of threat do they pose at the moment? Because you have people like, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Alejandro Intrabasaguas, who writes for OK Diario, and which is like one of the people from Vox, which is this Spanish fascist movement, is now kind of making headway in Latin America. He's kind of like pushing propaganda right now against the MAS movement in Bolivia, but also in places like Venezuela. So can you talk a little bit about the threat that these like right-wing forces pose?
Absolutely. Well, Alejandro Antrabasaguas, this person, Antrabasaguas, just has a very large audience and social media following from Spain. And what does he have to do with our continent? I'm not sure what his specific connection to Bolivia might be, but it's just, you leak something that is a photo and you say it's a photo of this, that, or the other, and it's not difficult for it to go viral. People don't really even respect a lot of the the news personalities that are here, they're happy to cling on to something else. But that was used for all of 2020 to try to get people, to try to build a case against the Mas and against the Mas running in this presidential race. But it ended up not working. And so now what you have is like a discombobulated right wing, that there's a lot of people who are not interested in accepting this defeat, and they're trying to take to the streets. So there's people who have blockaded some roads. It is like relatively small and limited to parts of Santa Cruz and Cochabamba. What we saw in La Paz was absolutely nothing. We saw a couple different protests, but it was never more than 100 people. And that's like in stark contrast with the protests that we saw that led up to the 2019 coup. So yesterday they, marched to an army division in Santa Cruz, and they said that this is something that's going on both online and in real life, of course, because people are, saying all sorts of extremist things on the internet. But they said that the military wants to support the people and carry out this coup, but they need the word. They're saying that, the military can't just step in unless there are essentially thousands of people in the streets, because they're concerned about, the optics about that. Some right-wing leaders are calling for a military junta, but the legitimacy will come in the support in the streets of the population. And so they're just trying to, but this is like, the election is on the 18th, this is 27th. The first day we saw like really big protests was, like in the middle of last week. So it's not really something that's growing. And the Mas party itself believes that it's just going to fall apart, because you have like Carlos Mesa, who won second place and has his, deputies and elected legislators. And some of them are pretending as if they want to, go the calm, peaceful route and just try to serve as the official opposition without causing any violence. So it's going to be really difficult if the right wing is split between the people who are, supposedly moderate and those who are, trying to call for a military coup. It might not last very long.
So talk about the return of Evo Morales and what that means, not just for Bolivia, but for Latin America in general.
Yeah, I mean, it was rumored that he was going to return, since he left, essentially. So for the past 11 months, we thought he was going to come back, but it's going to be a really big deal. This is like a very important leader that is basically the most influential person within all of Bolivia and among all of the social movements here. So just despite all the attacks and, everything that he's gone through and the Mas has gone through, if anything, he's just as popular or more now. And he'll be returning to, exert influence on the party and the social movements. I think that, given that he was, exiled from the country and he had to go operate from elsewhere, there was the risk that he could have lost his influence over people. People could, stop being interested in what he said. I have seen that happen in other cases. That's the reason why they, ejected him from the country to begin with, was so that he wouldn't, in their view, control everything. But this party and the movements like stand on their own without Evo Morales. But him coming back is going to infinitely strengthen kind of like the direction of things. It's really important that Evo Morales is such a strong leader and has foresight. He's really thinking of things in terms of like the international context. He's looking at things 5-10 years down the line. That's really important. That means that he's not just like a union leader, just a worker who is, a leftist and cares about the rights of campesinos and indigenous people. I mean, that is very much like the bare minimum. I think he's looking into the future and seeing how to strengthen bonds between the peoples of Bolivia and our continent, and also, now between like the Luis Arce government and the other progressive governments and also the right-wing governments of the region. Only Evo Morales had those sorts of amicable relationships with all of his neighbors, including the right-wing governments. He never had any issues. That was in like stark contrast with the way in which Venezuela has had to cut ties with some of its neighbors. So just in terms of like its significance, it just means that like the turnaround for a horrible thing taking place, which was like a coup that was surrounded by violence and supported by imperialist forces from all over the country, and then people rising up and defeating it, was a total of 11 months. So, I mean, it's a massive example for the rest of the continent. And in some ways, it gives me hope, but in other ways, I can see how far away some countries are. My country, of course, being El Salvador, which has a revolutionary history and a revolutionary party. It had an armed struggle with lots of important institutions, but that it would be very difficult for them to arrive at the level of organization that Bolivia has now. But it's definitely the pathway we'll all have to go and able to defeat neoliberalism from our continent.
Yeah, I mean, Bolivia defeated U.S. imperialism. Like that's what happened in these elections, and that's a major thing. Like that's huge. And there's a lot of people, like even within the indigenous movement, and there's been a lot of criticism of Evo Morales and this and that. And I always tell people, I was like, look, 500 years of history is nothing in comparison to 13 years in power. It's like when you like think of it like as a human being, like 13 years old, like what did you know when you were 13 years old, right? Like this project wasn't even really allowed. I mean, even what it accomplished in those 13 years was amazing, right? It was, there's not really a comparison, especially in the North, right? So there's, this criticism is unwarranted. And it's like, we have to remember the role that US imperialist forces play in crushing these movements before they're even allowed to walk, on their own and to really develop. And Bolivia actually began to walk on its own. It began to develop its, it had one of the most steady growing economies in Latin America. The kind of social gains that they made within that short period of time were really amazing. A lot of it was Luis Arce's economic policies and social policies. But at the same time, I think it shifted the geopolitical, or helped shift the geopolitical situation in Latin America. And whereas somebody like Chavez, Hugo Chavez, really played a central role, I'd also say that Evo Morales played an equally central role in that kind of leftward turn, as well as like Fidel Castro is, and I see them as like not as one being above the other, but I see them as equally kind of playing their own part in their own particular ways. And so this in my mind, I guess like his return, and the way I'm thinking about it is like it's like it's going to be huge. I think it'll be remembered for quite some time. Like I'm trying to think of an equivalent historical event, but I can't in my mind right now. But it's something that a lot of indigenous people that I know within our networks have really longed for. Like it's a restoration, not just of Moss, it's a restoration of that political project that like you said is projecting itself into the future. And it's not just Evo Morales. Evo Morales is the people in that movement. So my next question is thinking about last year, 2019. We saw broad popular uprisings across Latin America. And this year we're seeing the gains of those uprisings. The Chilean people just voted to rewrite their constitution after months of street level protests and backlash. But you also see, the backlash in places like Ecuador, which had its own kind of uprising and banning, Correísmo, the political project embodied in somebody like Rafael Correa. And the violent backlash against the left and the Workers' Party in Brazil, what is the future of the Latin American left? And, a lot of people in the North have said that the pink tide is waning and that it's over. Is that true?
Well, I just wanted to say I was speaking and that I was on mute for a while. So
Oh, sorry.
unfortunately, I was chiming in on what you were saying. And then I was like, oh, he's not hearing me. Well, I just wanted to say, like, with regards to the social gains of this last period of governance of the MAS and Evo Morales, that you can just see it absolutely everywhere in many parts of the country, here in particular. But this place just has so much wealth, and so does all of Latin America. We're just wealthy with natural resources. It's so beautiful. There's so much fertile land. People can eat well, they can live beautifully. It's just a paradise for miles and miles and countries and countries. And I can only assume, because I don't have the experience of having lived in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, that it's similar. But the indigenous people and campesinos have so much opportunity to live a beautiful life if they don't have a neoliberal dictatorship at this point, essentially. And so I think that when you've been to a place where people live in extreme poverty, such as Brazil, and Brazil has been like this for a long time, and of course it's been worse since Michel Temer took power in the coup. Just absolutely a massive portion of the population lives out on the streets, literally like under highway underpasses, under bridges. They live in like favelas with just absolutely terrible conditions, no running water. And this is like in the city. In rural areas, there's extreme poverty as well. People don't eat well. There's just horrible malnutrition in every part of the country. And that's just like an extreme contrast to here. I think here, people do all sorts of jobs, including, some people are just selling things on the side of the road. Some people have a shop. Most people are some sort of farmers. But everyone is eating the same, like fried fish with yuca and chocolo, and the same, like watermelon juice for lunch as the tourists would be. That's just like unbelievable that there exists virtually no poverty in this area. Of course, that's the reason why the elites in other parts of the country absolutely hate this mass stronghold area, where literally on like the highways and the lampposts and everything are painted blue, white, and black. But this is really just an example of how we should expect our living standards to be absolutely everywhere in every country. Like my favorite part about this region is it's exactly what El Salvador is in a lot of ways. Well, the area of El Salvador that I consider home, in terms of lush and green and humid and hot, and farmers, and the sort of culture, the way things smell and taste and everything, except there are no gangs. So there's no insecurity. It's pretty unbelievable. And so, I mean, it's just unbelievable that anyone would want to attack those gains and not, the opposite, which is try to see what took place here and try to expand this to every corner of the country and to everywhere on the continent. In terms of the sort of comment on the pink tide having waned over the past little while, I think, a big part of that pink tide was like the 10 years in office of President Rafael Correa. And, that party has very much been an extremely important ongoing force on the continent. And for that reason, the right wing, sent a number of people into exile. They too had to go to the Mexican embassy, just like here, where leaders of the MAS had to go to the Mexican embassy. This is around the same time. And in Quito, people had to flee to the Mexican embassy or to Mexico for their own safety, because they were chased out by a traitor, Lenin Moreno, who stands for nothing except, IMF loans, neoliberalism, and corruption. And but still from the exterior, Rafael Correa, who's a really important leader, has been able to organize his bases. People are very much opposed to the current government, so that's going to help them a lot in this upcoming election, and they have their own presidential ticket. So it's, there is a huge likelihood that they'll be able to come back to power, and there's just no way at this point that, given all that's happened with Brazil, that they'll be able to, that they would allow for another Bolsonaro candidate to take office once again. So I think, we've had to learn our lessons, but along the way, it's just the kind of guidance and those like pillars of strength that are Cuba and Venezuela have been extremely important. And I think that, people will be calling it a pink wave in the next couple of years once again.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I was in Caracas, we went to one of the communes there, and I asked one of the comrades like what they thought of this kind of assessment. I was there last October, and so it was like in the midst of these kind of popular uprisings, and just right before the coup in Bolivia. And I actually had the opportunity, the privilege to meet David Chicahuanca at just this random. He was just there at something, and I was like, dude, like you look like my grandpa. But he was a really sweet guy. But anyways, I asked this comrade at one of these communes, like about the pink tide, and he got really upset with me. And he's like, we're not a pink tide. I'm a leftist. He's like, I'm a revolutionary. This is a revolution. This isn't some kind of progressive social movement. He's like, we actually are trying to build a revolutionary movement. And he was talking about not just the communes in Venezuela, but he was also talking about, the MST in Brazil, which, he had his commune had created these really kind of important links with and drew a lot of inspiration from. And I think that's important to remember that, like, we see these as elections, and people in the North were saying like, oh, look, you can vote out fascism. And it completely distorts like what's happening in the South and like in places like Bolivia, is that like people, like, yeah, the ballot box is important, but it's tied to movements, like actual social movements that are trying to build a real alternative to not just to neoliberalism, but also the status quo itself, and trying to push the envelope in whatever way they can, and that literally comes from the ground up. It's not just a parliamentarian kind of struggle. It's a real struggle that's being built in the streets, that has to be fought over. There's not just, oh, you just get somebody in power and then it's everything's gravy, but there still exists like class conflict and the need to protect those political and social gains.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the philosophy we're applying to Kasashwa News, of course. Mm-hmm. It's not, we never want anyone to think that we're some sort of, or we never want to become some sort of mouthpiece for a government, because it's just not necessary. I mean, governments and politicians and, administrations will come and go, but this struggle on the ground and the social movements, in this case, the social movements are embedded in the party, is forever. And it's a really long struggle. Like you said earlier, a few years, 13, 14 years of governments is nothing compared to 500 years of resisting colonialism. And so it's just something that needs to be covered on an ongoing basis. That's exactly what has been kind of wrong with the approach and philosophy of the mainstream media. And that's why they've been getting Latin America wrong all along, because they haven't covered things on the ground. A lot of people saw the opportunity to come to Bolivia after the amount of, hoopla that I made about it. And quite frankly, and, came in to cash in on it on one way or another. It's been the same with Venezuela and a lot of other issues and countries. And I think that the role of international alternative media is very important in Latin America, and there needs to be coverage in English, especially by those who have the resources to do so. So I'm very happy to be reporting on these issues alongside those outlets and those people. I think it's very important that they continue to do that. But I think that our role has to be, as Kasashwa News, especially Ollie and I, And, some of our other friends, Brian Meir with Brazil Wire, and the guys at Venezuela Analysis are people who are covering things on the ground, even when it's really boring to everyone else, even when no one else cares. And it's just going to be always like that people don't care until there is an election or coup or a mercenary attack. And then all of a sudden it's popular again to drop in and try to, squeeze yourself in there. But and I see that, like, there's these sort of like posts online where someone all of a sudden from like let's say like PBS in the US wants a guest on Bolivia, and they'll say, okay, who's a good person to have on Bolivia? And they'll just tag this like long list of like leftist Americans who've like either never been to Bolivia or just started covering it like this month, and it's just hilarious because I just can't imagine like what the kind of insight they would have compared to someone like my colleague Oli Vargas, obviously. But yeah, I just think that going forward, things are just going to really have to change in the way the media approaches these struggles. You're not going to be able to paint things as a pink tide or as, simply as simplified as we've been putting it lately. I think we're going to have to learn to touch base with social movements and see Latin America as a map in which there are overlying political forces across international borders of both social movements, political forces, different indigenous peoples, and different interests, and that there's a lot happening beyond just elections and on an ongoing basis. I think there's a real need for a permanent presence of reporting here. I mean, Bolivia is just like one country. Venezuela is another country. I mean, I'm not really sure who people refer to for really important news on places like Peru and Colombia. Those are massive countries with massive scandals absolutely every day. And, I think we now have the ability, now that this is kind of over, it's not over, but the election is over. I think it's really important to look back at the different reporting that went on around Bolivia and kind of, hold some people accountable, both in the Bolivian national media and internationally, and see how we can correct that. It's just, there's so many people in this world who they sit in their, I don't know, parents' basement or at Starbucks, whatever it is, and write articles all day for their blogs, and who are, famous personalities and all sorts of other actors within the media with so many resources. And yet it's so difficult. I still find that if I needed to go find a really good source or article on a certain country, like Paraguay or Uruguay, for example, the only thing I would find is a couple of, progressive leftist academic professors in the US or Canada, like one person who, has done some research in that country. But in terms of like the news, it would be really difficult. So I think that's something that just needs to be examined right now. It's something I'm thinking of every single day. How do we make it so that we have English speakers, we have some people on the ground? Now we need to turn this into an ongoing project to make sure that everybody knows what's going on and that we're all connected. I mean, this is just starting in Latin America, but obviously that need is still there for Africa and other parts of the world.
Camila, I'm going to come in here for a second and ask you about something more specific, namely the importance of alliances outside of Latin America for the sort of countries that make up the so-called pink tide. I mean, I think that's also a simplified term. I think you're right that like we tend to, I wanted to respond to something you said earlier, which is like we tend to kind of conglomerate these things into easy keywords and phrases that like, people there might use sort of interchangeably, but they don't sort of organize it the way we do. And so I agree with you, obviously, everything you're saying about seeing views from the ground and alternative media. So to that extent, I'm wondering about what's been the response to the seemingly intensified connections between Iran and Venezuela, and specifically around oil and like the tankers, because the Venezuelan oil industry has taken a big hit in recent years. Just infrastructurally, it's been subject to a lot of sabotage. So maybe you could give us a kind of, if people don't know about it, maybe if you can summarize it or just kind of give us a sense of like, what has been the response to those? Like, has there been a kind of like, and especially in terms of what's going to happen in Bolivia, in that they'll probably be sanctioned if Mas can make it into another government, if they can reinstall their power again and push out the coup people permanently, then they're going to be subject to the next thing that these sort of imperialists do, which is sanctions. So I wonder sort of the meaning of solidarity and sort of regional solidarity and global solidarity to these movements. That's a big jumble of a question. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, I think that this is, a perfect example of the Bolivarian government of Venezuela responding to the immediate material needs of the Venezuelan people and looking at examples of more prosperous countries that are doing better off, like Bolivia, and trying to figure out how it is that they can ensure and guarantee these basic necessities for the people. And so they've gone to absolutely great lengths to ensure that people have basic necessities, given just the absolutely, historic levels of attacks. The only country in the Americas that has, undergone similar attacks is in Cuba, but that was, it was more over time and gradual. In the case of Venezuela, it's largely been within the last few years that it's really intensified. And so, this has just been like absolutely crucial. It's just like the very basic right to free trade among nations, sovereign nations, and so because they've found their way around this one particular issue, which is due to the sanctions, as you said, there have the infrastructure of the oil production has been diminished. There's also like a lack of spare parts that Iran was also able to provide. It is now, that relationship has come under attack by the right wing. So there's this massive propaganda war that I don't even know if, like, the extent to which people see it in the English mainstream media, but it's just like another version of what we see in Bolivia, which is just outrageous things being said. They say that they say that there's this close relationship between leftist, radical forces of both Latin America and the Middle East, essentially, which is they want to forge a connection between the ELN, which is still a guerrilla armed group, and then the FARC, which is just completely demobilized. There's some dissidents with arms, and then they say Hezbollah and other government,
the usual suspects,
forces. Yeah. Yeah, and I just think I don't know the extent to which that works here. It's really difficult for me to say, because maybe I'm in a bubble and I just see it all around the online right-wing media, and it just seems absolutely ridiculous. They said the same thing here. We should say that here, exactly where I am in the Topico, that they've said that some, Ollie was telling me that some people were actually from other parts of the country, because as I said, this is a bit of a tourist destination. It has some like tourism infrastructure. The hotels are, a little resorty, things like that. And some people from other parts of the country wouldn't want to come here because they said, from what they heard, that you could get kidnapped by the FARC, which is just absolutely hilarious. I don't know where to begin on that, because like South America is very, very, very large. By plane, it takes a long time to get here from Quito, for example. And Quito is close to Colombia, where these guerrilla groups would have been. For them to have gotten this far means they just have taken over the entire continent. The fact is that doesn't exist. 100% of those, that sort of conflict and everything just is contained within Colombia, even still now. But so yeah, they were just trying to. So in Venezuela, they've been, I'm not really sure what the who they're trying to scare. The population there, even the most conservative right-wing people in Venezuela, are very progressive socially, if that makes any sense. But it's, people are quite educated as well. So, left to right, I can't imagine what kind of impact that would have. But I think it's actually more for the international community in some senses. Like when you have like Mike Pompeo and Julio Borges in Bogota talking about, these groups are aligned with President Nicolas Maduro. It's to say that they're involved in corruption and siphoning the resources of the people to fund, larger projects that are linked to paramilitarism and terrorism on other continents. It's to make this more of an international issue. And so it's just, and also they've been saying that there's no oil even coming to Venezuela, or there's no inputs coming in order for Venezuela to be able to produce its own gas. Anything that's coming here is being turned around and produced and processed directly to take back to Cuba to fund the regime in Cuba. So it's just all sorts of like outlandish things like that. I mean, we know that Venezuela, anytime it has been able to the government is able to get its hands on any sort of supply, including during the COVID-19 pandemic, that it shared ventilators and PCR and rapid test kits and things like that with its neighboring countries in the Caribbean. But of course, while also like taking care of the Venezuelan people first. So I think that it's just kind of, just the right wing kicking and screaming and trying to find a way to turn around something that's just regular trade and cooperation that all countries participate in, and trying to make it a bad thing. But hopefully, I think with Venezuela, we have been able to, reveal a little bit of that propaganda war against the Bolivarian government and people and movements. And I think it's just becoming a little bit more transparent what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, there was like an Iranian supermarket that opened branches in Venezuela, and you would think that this is like a cure to cancer. That like the way that the news that this was like made, the news of this is that, like, as you said, this is just regular trade between allies. But because everything they do is nefarious, there's this weird kind of like look at these people as if they're in like a jar, and like and writing about them, that like, if you just look up Iranian supermarket Venezuela, there are literally dozen plus articles. And this isn't like the entire world has supermarkets from other countries in their country, right? Like most agricultural products ship in from all different parts of the world, but God forbid, the countries that we think are like rogue and evil and whatever, God forbid they do normal things. So you have to like make an issue out of everything. And so that's what you were saying earlier, that this business of like only paying attention to Bolivia when there's a coup, that's also part of the problem, right? Is that then you are part of like the media stampede when something bad happens, right? And so like not being interested in a place and not paying attention to like the alternative media, like there's the lesson in what happened in Bolivia, I think, for the left, not just in terms of what Mas did, which was heroic and stuff. Obviously, there's always that. Like, don't get me wrong, but I mean also in studying the left reaction to the coup, and the hand wringing and the shirt tugging, and like the ultra leftists being like, well, he did some pretty bourgeois things, so I guess he had it coming. He's no friend of mine. Like people were saying these things in the midst of like a right wing fascist coup, right? That like this strange, absurd kind of bar that anti-imperialist movements are judged by is so absurdly high. I mean, in a way, it forces those countries to do better. That if they screw up, that they're going to have a host of people sort of scrutinizing their actions. But it warps the general view of things. Anyways, that's a big, long question. Maybe if we could just follow like a quick thing on, in terms of like what you've heard about the potential sort of realignment of foreign policy. I mean, I think you touched upon it earlier. Maybe this is for my podcast, but maybe like what this will mean. Like Bolivia is not a huge foreign policy player, but its solidarity with the Palestinians, for instance, was a very potent sort of symbol of global legitimacy of their struggle. I imagine those things under the new, like the restored Mas government, are going to be fast tracked through, or like who cares about that for now? Let's just get the government back kind of situation.
I think it will be fast tracked through, actually. I mean, I think that one of the things that Evo Morales probably realized about the time that the coup was already in motion was that that he should have kept certain allies closer, and one of those, most importantly, was Venezuela. I think he was very just friendly with everyone. Like I said, he even had a good relationship with Mauricio Macri and with Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia, I think now they're going to, try to prioritize a little things better. It's not going to, I don't, well, it's difficult to say, like, as an individual, what Luis Arce's kind of treatment of these countries is going to be. But I think as a party, there's a lot of, people just want to have good cooperation and good trade with these countries. They want medical cooperation with China and Russia and Cuba. One of the first things that the government's going to have to do is bring just out of necessity doctors back here. It's not really just some leftist party that's going on here. It's actually just like a dire need of the people. That people rather just like eat a plant, which is totally fine, especially if it works, it's preferred. But if people are actually really dying of something and something's really serious, that people are afraid to go to hospitals and go to clinics because the conditions there just aren't well. There's a lot of kind of like malpractice, quite frankly. And yeah, Bolivia was just never really able to advance, without the help of the Cuban doctors that were immediately sent away. So that's going to be a priority. But I think also just, it's really important that Bolivia continue to play or play a role within, these regional bodies such as ALBA, as Venezuela does, and build these links with the Caribbean nations that are so important. There is like a very strong, I guess, anti-imperialist bloc within the Caribbean, and that's the CARICOM nations. Almost all of them have a very close and important relationship with Cuba and Venezuela, and they've just been absolutely, key to, to sort of like eradicating the threat of aggression from, or limiting the threat of aggression from the seas. Obviously, the U.S. is still patrolling the Caribbean Sea and threatening Venezuela, but it's only because for so long, that they've been patrolling.
They did try to assassinate Maduro on multiple occasions by drones. They did do that.
Absolutely.
Do you remember when they did that and we just kind of wrote it off like, oh, those wacky Yanks, always up to their... It's like Bugs Bunny or like, Wile E. Coyote level of silliness now, of just like, oh, another assassination attempt on Maduro.
Yeah, the timing didn't really fit well into like the news cycle and everything, because it happened on a Saturday night and it happened in the summer before like the school year and everything began again. It was in the beginning of August 2018. I mean, I only remember because I was up 24 hours covering this because it was my responsibility to do so. But I guess it did kind of seem that people weren't really catching on to it, except this one clip that they show of military running in different directions, like a 14-second clip. But I think that Bolivia will have to just play a larger role. Obviously, yeah, it is a small country, not a big, player, as you said, or it hasn't been before. But I think, what is a big country? I mean, what do you have to do to like get on the map? Because like I'm from a country that has 5 million people and it has neighbors of about approximately the same size. So I think that's one of the things that like I guess we have to like stop thinking about it in terms of that, and just
it's the like how they embody a kind of independence from the imperialist system, right? Like that's the fear. It's not that Bolivia is going to invade the US. Like this is, it's smaller than Southern California, like in terms of population, right? Like it's the symbol that you can leave our system and thrive. And that's what's not allowed. Forget nationalizing lithium. I think like you could, like imperialists can move their resources around. I mean, not to say it's not important, but I think it's more the symbolic kind of pride. And it's not to say it's just masculinist kind of effective thing, but really it's a sense that like we need to make an example of anyone who upends us, who challenges us, who provokes, who fights us. I mean, this is a transhistoric argument, but this is why has the history of Cuba or Haiti for the last 200 years been perpetual sort of imperialist bullying? because they dared to sort of break away 200 years ago. I think in some ways they have to be punished, these countries. If they can't be turned, if they can't be couped and like brought back into the fold, they have to be punished. And then sanctions and all that stuff will kick in. So I'm going to stop now.
They're hoping that sanctions, meaning the US, Washington is hoping that sanctions never come into play here. They want to, continue to support the pro-coup agents here on the ground and try to find ways for things to sort of organically go their way. So that's going to continue to be the case. Whether or not government comes in now next week and bans NGOs once again, it's very easy for them to funnel money through different means to these different far-right actors. And those people are always going to want to be here. They own tons of land and have their own, businesses. And so it's just going to be, they're always going to have that to confide in. And so I don't like to get to the point where they actually have to sanction this powerful sovereign government as Venezuela. I don't think they ever want to even arrive at that. I think they're just calmly waiting for things to kind of go their way. And continue pushing them in that direction. That's exactly the reason why Carlos Mesa and Janine Áñez and all of these supposedly more moderate forces of the right wing have decided to concede so quickly, because they're not actually conceding. They're just conceding to this idea that like the vote was carried out, democratically, transparently, cleanly with an electoral board that they armed themselves. And that it's really difficult to argue against that and use the same sort of arguments as last year. It would be kind of taken as a joke. The international community has caught on to it, but they're going to look for other means. I mean, there's some people who might flee the country, but there are other people who are going to say that, I didn't commit any crimes against humanity per se, so I'm going to stay here and just try to take over, from here, from within the country. So I do think that, this struggle is like not over. Just every single day, there's just, rampant rumors about what's going to happen, that, the military is going to turn on the incoming government, that the military is going to take power right now. Janine Áñez is going to step down. They say that, all sorts of things. So I think it's just kind of like a very active situation. And so I can't imagine Washington just giving up on Bolivia. I think they have really seen that, symbolic value, as you've said, of a government that will stand up against imperialism and take control of its own territory without the intervention or reliance on external forces. And so they want to fight that now. They want to nip it at its butt.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up this interview. Thank you so much, Camila, for joining us. Before we go, can you tell us where we can support your work and find your work?
Yeah, you can support our work at Saskatchewan News on Twitter and Facebook. And we'll be launching a website. We should have done it before all of this happened, but I was traveling and it was my responsibility to do so. But now it'll happen. We're definitely going to be expanding coverage, essentially now that everything has calmed down in terms of the reporting on the actual election. And I think it's just going to be a really good space to get more insight into what people are doing here on the ground, what things look like outside of a coup. And of course, at Camila Telesur on Twitter and at Camila Press are my Twitter handles.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll put all this in the show notes for people who want to check it out more.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Camila.